So we've learned about high and low pressure. Now let's dive into fronts. Fronts are probably the second most common thing that you'll hear when you hear meteorologists talk about weather maps. And there are several different types of fronts. But first, before we dive into those, we have to look at what they're delineating, what they're the boundaries between. So fronts are basically the boundaries between different air masses across the country. So this is a map of several different types of air masses. And you basically have two main types, and they're either the continental air masses, which are air masses that start basically over land or the continent, and these are dry air masses. And then the maritime air masses. These are more ocean-related air masses, and they're more moist. And then you also have kind of a descriptor. So are they coming from the Arctic or the polar regions, or are they coming more from the tropic regions in the lower latitudes? So putting those different things together, for example, y'all in Farmington there, and for me in Texas, we're typically in what's called a continental tropical air mass. And what that is it's an air mass that originates over the continent, and so it's dry, and it's tropical, and so it's typically warmer or hotter. So that's typically what we get. If you're more up north, then it's a continental polar or maritime polar, or even if you're up in Canada, it then becomes an Arctic air mass. So putting together where the air is coming from and basically the temperature of the air masses help us distinguish what type they are. And then the boundary between them becomes a front. So if you have different types of air behind them, whether that's cooler air or warmer air, that helps distinguish what type of front they are. So as these air masses move, as they run into each other, these fronts serve as the boundaries between them. So the first type of front is a stationary front, and that's basically just when two air masses collide and they really can't go anywhere. So the two air masses are strong enough, and then they really don't move. And so what that's characterized by is between these two air masses, you do get a lot of precipitation at times as these two air masses run into each other right along a stationary front. Probably the most common front that you'll hear about is a cold front. That's where a colder air mass is replacing a warmer air mass. So think about that continental polar air mass from the north coming down and replacing our tropical air mass here in the southern United States. So basically what you get is you get this dome of cold air because it's more dense, and it pushes that warmer air up and over that dome. And what you do is as that air goes up, it condenses and forms thunderstorms as it's pushed up in the atmosphere. So right along that front where that air is being pushed up and over, you often get a strong band of showers and thunderstorms, sometimes some severe weather right along that front. So as you can see here, here's the warmer out ahead of the front being forced up and over it as the cold air moves in. A warm front's sort of the opposite. You have a warm air mass replacing the cooler air mass. Now, because that warmer air mass is typically a lot more shallow, you get a more broad area of upward motion. So instead of a lot of storms, typically with the cold front, you get just more rain showers as that warm air again is forced up and over the cold air. But since it's not as steep of a push, as more of an upward push, you just get some rain instead of a lot of severe weather and a lot of thunderstorms like you would with a cold front. A dry line is another type of front, but instead of being a boundary between two different temperature air masses, here we're talking more about a dry air and a moist air mass. So that often happens due to all of the Gulf moisture that forms down in Texas in the southeast United States. You get this dry line that sets up across West Texas, and that drier air, again being more dense, forces that moist air up and over it, and again can cause a lot of showers and thunderstorms right along the dry line. That's more across the Central Plains. That's more to areas west of you in Farmington. So for y'all, the main concern would be cold fronts and warm fronts. Here's what they look like on weather maps. Basically, the symbols always denote the direction that the front is moving. So a cold front like this would be moving to the southeast, or the northeast for this warm front, or this dry line moving eastward. Again, stationary fronts, when they alternate like this, they're not moving much at all. So here's what they look like on a weather map. They're usually attached to a low pressure system, and then you either get cold fronts, or here's a warm front coming off here. No dry line on this day because this cold front had already moved through and kind of dried everything out. But this is what they look like. And then this is what dry lines do look like. And here again, you can see all this moisture out ahead of the dry line here. You see all this wind, all the wind barbs again feeding up in to the area between the warm front, the dry line, and the cold front. And so really this whole area right here is the area that we'd expect all the storms. So the brief review here is that cold fronts are boundaries between cooler air back behind them. Notice here it's 40s and 50s with 60s out ahead of it. Dry lines are moisture boundaries. So notice the green numbers here in the 60s. So this is very moist air. And the numbers in the 30s and 40s, drier air back behind this. And then warm fronts are, again, boundaries between warmer air to the south of them, see here in the 70s, and a little bit cooler air out ahead of them here in the 50s and 60s. So air mass changes can either be temperature or moisture related, and boundaries between them are called fronts.